Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. This is one of over 1,000 programs we've done since the pandemic shifted us to live streaming and YouTube. We also have live audiences. But today we have Alexandra Hudson with us, the author of The Soul of Civility. We have it's a very interesting look into, well, first of all, the difference between civility and politeness is a very important thing, but also this whole idea about civility and who's written about it, who's talked about it, and what stories have been told about it, and why, obviously, we have a need to remember about this in our current situation politically and just socially after the pandemic. So first of all, welcome to the Commonwealth Club, Alexandra. Really great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Thrilled to be here.
And I'd like to start with where you started. You started with a quote, which I thought was just great. And it was about suspicion of authority, I think, that politeness and suspicion of authority don't always go together. And you told stories about your DC time. So why don't we start there? It seems like a good place to start for what you experienced.
So I came to my interest in this topic, honestly, this topic of civility. My mother is something of an expert on manners. She's called Judy the Manners Lady. Mm-hmm. And while I was writing this book, actually, I discovered that my mother is one of 4 women who are internationally renowned experts on manners and etiquette named Judy. There are 4 of them. I don't know if it was a generational thing. My mother always says that she was named after Judy Garland after The Wizard of Oz came out. So it was just like a generation of Judys, and several of them went to the etiquette industry. So my mother is my favorite of these Judiths in the etiquette business. And she's the epitome of civility, true civility as I define it in my book, just utter self-forgetfulness, utter other-orientedness. Our home growing up was this revolving door of strangers and newcomers to our community. We had homestays live with us. We had, immigrants dine with us. And my mom just is passionate about manners and social norms to the extent that they help us do this beautiful and often fraught thing called life together across deep difference. And so my mother's like an expert in true civility, but she also taught us about the ways and means of politeness. And I am someone who is constitutionally allergic to authority. I hate rule. I hate being told what to do. Even to this day, I cringe when someone tells me what to do. I'm like, I want to know why. I hunger, and I always have hungered for a justification for why we do things the way we do them, and why, should we follow a norm or expectation just because it's the way it's been done, just because somewhere, sometime, some self-appointed authority, some Judy the Manners Lady of some other era decided that we should. Is that sufficient rationale for following blindly a rule? So I always questioned norms and these rules, hungered to understand them at a deeper level, but I followed them because my mother promised me that they would lead me to success in work, school, and life, and she was right. Mm-hmm. Until I found myself at the United States Department of Education. I was in federal government from 2017 to 2018, a very divided time in our world, in our country. And there, it was this environment of anti-human flourishing, to be quite honest with you. It was, I saw these 2 extremes. On one hand, there were people with sharp elbows. There were people who were willing to step on anyone to get ahead. And on the other hand, there were people who I thought were my people at first. They were polished and poised and polite, well-versed in the ways and means of politeness. But these are the people who would smile and flatter me one moment and stab me and others in the back the next, the moment that we no longer served their purposes. And I realized several things from this experience. One is that these 2 extremes largely represent the extremes in our public life today. We have the kind of kumbaya people who want us to just do life together, be nicer to one another, and kind of want to tone police and just just be nice, And then there's this other contingent that says no, the stakes are too high, and they're bellicose and aggressive, and there's this kind of misunderstanding that the bullying and the aggression will like puncture the hypocrisy of just the niceness of the polish, and that the bullying is like an antidote, the aggression's an antidote to the politeness. But I actually realized, this leads to my second insight, that they seem like polar opposites, but they're actually very similar. That the extreme hostility and extreme politeness, the both inherently they instrumentalize others. They insufficiently appreciate the dignity of what it means to be human, and they see other people as means to their selfish ends. The aggressive and hostile contingent sees other people as pawns to be bowled over, steamrolled. And the polite contingent sees others as pawns to be manipulated, discarded. But both have an insufficiently high view of the gift of being human and the respect we are owed no to others by virtue of this gift of being human, by virtue of our inherent dignity and irreducible worth as human beings. And then that led me to a third insight, that there is an essential distinction between civility and politeness. That politeness is etiquette, it's manners, it's technique, it's behavior. Whereas civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals who are worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. And that crucially, sometimes actually respecting someone, sometimes actually loving someone requires being impolite, breaking the rules of propriety and niceness and etiquette for the sake of having an honest but uncomfortable conversation, engaging in robust debate. The undercurrent, the argument of my book is that we need less of this faux civility, which goes by politeness, tone policing and just trying to polish over difference, and more true civility, actually respecting others, even when it means being impolite, making people uncomfortable by having uncomfortable conversations, even risking offending someone by broaching a topic that might feel taboo, that sometimes there are important conversations that need to be had. And we can't be satisfied just polishing over those differences, as the etymology of these words suggest, politeness suggests. We have to be able to grapple with difference head on.
Yeah, a couple of things. Very interesting to me, because when I read your book, the first thing I thought was, boy, did she have fun when she realized that she didn't have to be polite, but she could still listen to her mother. Because, it's like I can be civil, I found a place where I can be against authority and still have the basis of what my mother taught me.
Exactly. Yeah. The whole book is an extension of my anti-authoritarianism. Exactly.
And one of the characters in the novel, a 6-year-old boy, I had him say, someone said, his mother told him, "You just have to do it. It's a tradition. It's authority. It's a tradition."
Tradition.
Tradition must be all those things that people do that they don't know why they do them.
That's right.
And, it's pretty much a good definition of it. So in D.C., you ran up against what people, lots of people who are, sincere and are trying to help and stuff like that, run into them in academic departments, at hospitals where they work. This kind of attitude. But as you said, I think you pinpointed it. It is that they think of other people as pawns in their game, and not to say anything too strong in their favor, but people do see the world in their own minds, and so it looks like they're the center of the universe. Everybody, and you have to kind of be trained to come out of that and to see you're just one of many. And I think that your history of this whole idea is a lot of people trying to do that training.
It's a great point. If you don't mind me just taking that and running with it for a moment, this notion of cultivation, that this is not natural, but it has to be cultivated, is actually quite central. The metaphor of the garden is the central metaphor of my book. I say that civilization itself is like a garden. And it's not natural. We each have a little plot of land in this garden of civilization, and all we can control in our plot of land is what we cultivate, and what is cultivated within us by the other plots of land that have a say in our lives, like family members. But especially as we grow and become autonomous adults, that we choose for ourselves what we plant, what we cultivate, and we can either plant seeds of beautiful flowers and regenerative crops that bring beauty and abundant, life-giving props to the soil, but also to surrounding plots of land, that bring joy and delight and contribute and foster this joint garden of civilization comprised of each individual plots of land, each citizen. Or we can, with our words and actions, with our habits, nurture and cultivate seeds of corrosive, invasive species that zap nutrients from the soil and that corrode into other plots of land as well. And that all we can control is our plot of land. We can't control what other people choose to do, but that it is a true civilization is comprised of individuals who choose to, as Samuel Johnson said, tend to the needs of the poor, the vulnerable, those crucially that can't just do things for us in return, those that can never do anything for us in return. That was Samuel Johnson, the English writer's definition of civilization. He's the author of the first English dictionary. He said, like, a true civilization is how a society treats the poor and the vulnerable in a society. And so this idea that this notion of cultivation of the garden, that it's not natural to us to put others first. Like I get to this duality in human nature, that we are profoundly social as a species. We've become fully human in relationship with others. And yet morally and biologically, we're defined also by self-love. We're driven to meet our own needs before others. And those two things, aspects of who we are in tension: the social, the self, the love of others and love of self. And that is why this thing called life together, friendship, community, civilization itself, democracy, is never a foregone conclusion. It is always fragile. It is always precarious. And it depends on our how we choose to cultivate these habits of civility, of other-orientedness, of respecting the fundamental dignity and worth of our fellow human beings in our everyday.
So I have a question about your mother. So you said she was the epitome of self-forgetfulness, I think is the way you put it. And yet, was she a happy person or an unhappy person?
She is the most joy-filled human being you will ever meet in your life. She is utter effervescence and ebullience. Like, she just brings like this ball of energy and joy and light wherever she goes. It is remarkable. And the only person I've ever met who it matches her and in fact exceeds her in her joy and for life and others is my grandmother, who I talk about as well. And who was like an order of magnitude more zealous about the human social project. And I don't know if you remember that part of the book, this idea of the mellifluous echo of the magnanimous soul, that is the power of one person to create a ripple effect, a mellifluous echo, one magnanimous soul, one self-forgetful person, one great-souled human being who is so self-composed they can just be focused on others throughout their life and throughout their day, as opposed to being bogged down by the pettiness and nitpicking, like, oh, this person, irked me, and so I'm going to take it out on this person. The kind of kicking that the vicious cycle, the sort of kicking the dog mentality. That the opposite is also true. That one person brightening your day, like my grandmother or my mother have done this millions of times, like small acts of kindness create a mellifluous echo. They create a ripple effect. And like one person living their life according to that other-oriented logic has an echo that we will never see or fully appreciate this side of eternity. Like, they invested in people. They did things great and small that they don't even remember, but that changed people's lives and made the world better and brighter.
So let's do a little bit of etymology. You have a little bit of etymology in your book too. So you use the word generous, and you showed how gentleman, progeny, it's all related to the word, and the word means birth, I think, if I remember correctly, in Greek and Latin. And so we go back to that time. So why don't you say a little bit about how those things fit together, and then I'm going to go back to your mother.
Yeah, it's a great, I love etymology. I love the history, the stories behind words. Etymology is throughout my book because it's not just fascinating, the stories behind our language. It's often very illuminating, and it's also a great mnemonic to help us remember concepts. But I mean, the relationship between the etymology of birth and our word generous was it's very classist It's very hierarchical. It goes back to a time where it was thought that only the wealthy could be generous, right? Only if you had stuff to give could you be generous. And I mean, the reality is there are many ways of being generous. Anyone can be generous. It's that you can be generous emotionally, psychologically, intellectually. And like I talk about in the book, intellectual hospitality. Can we entertain ideas that can contradict our own in our head? That's a form of intellectual hospitality, intellectual generosity. And so I love that. And this is one, practical benefit of our egalitarian society without rigid classes that we are born in and die in. That was a lot of human history. The lot you were given at birth was the lot that you died with. There was not a lot of social and economic mobility that we do enjoy today. And the same is true with the etymology of our word philanthropy. The word philanthropy comes from the Greek philanthropia, philo meaning love, and anthropos meaning humanity and human being. And that's what philanthropy is. Today, we associate philanthropy with, billionaires who are pledging all of their wealth to fight, malaria or polio or, great, important causes. And yet, love of humanity is a value that we can and should embody, all of us, every single one of us. And this is actually, a defining idea in my book, that this is back toward this idea of cultivation, that civility is cultivated. I have a whole chapter in my book on education, that the educational project is creating good humans. And what a good human is cultivating with us an appreciation of the profound gift of being human in both ourselves and in others, that really the educational project is cultivating philanthropy, love of humanity, not just a specific contingent of philanthropy, right? Not just the people who are like us, who agree with us, who can do things for us in return, but humanity in general. That is what the educational project ought to be, what it often has been, at least as an aspiration. And it's an aspiration that can guide and should guide how we educate today.
So I'd like to go back to Socrates before we hit the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the other stuff from the past that you bring in here. But Socrates mentioned that people are always think of themselves as good, but what they miss is their perspective. What is in the distance they don't see properly, and therefore they make misjudgments about their self-interest, as opposed to a tension between the self-interest and between self-love and love of others. It seems to me that the conclusion from a Socratic point of view is that unselfishness is an intelligent form of self-interest. Your mother and your grandmother were both happy, and that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing this for. Everything. It's all to get that emotion. So if it's in your self-interest, it won't be such a tense experience if you see it clearly. And I think that that's part of the educational project, is to say this, not that you just completely give everything away, but that being generous to other people. One of the conclusions that I have is that you should be even more generous to other people than you would ever expect anyone to be to you. To me, that's better than the golden rule, because that golden rule is a kind of equivalent thing. But if you realize that your generosity is enjoyable, what's stopping you? What's stopping you from giving it away? It's free. It's free to give away.
It's such a great insight. I love everything about that. And I originally had a whole footnote in my book. I think it got nixed in the editing process, dedicated to what some have called enlightened self-interest. This is an idea given to us from Alexis de Tocqueville, from Adam Smith. I talked about that there are different gradations of self-interest, right? Like Bernard Mandeville, famously in his Fable of the Bees, said that actually vice is a virtue. Single-mindedly pursuing your self-interest can actually produce public benefits in society. So anyway, I have a nuanced, sophisticated discussion in that I think got nixed, but I should publish that elsewhere because it is an important distinction. But I think you're absolutely right. That when we single-mindedly act in our own interest in ways that alienate ourselves from others, we hurt ourselves at many levels, like both practically and societally. Like when we cut ourselves off from when we're selfish, like people don't want to be around us. And I'll tell you a story. One time when I was in government, a colleague came up to me and asked me for help with a project. He told me I looked, radiant that day and I was brilliant and no one could help him but me. And I was happy to help. He didn't have to flatter me like that gratuitously for me to be willing to help him. But I didn't realize though, he was expecting me to do his entire project for him. And I was like, okay, I've committed, like I did it. And then he passed off my work as his own and, took all the credit and went to all the meetings that I was prepared for because I had done the work, but he, he did not. And then after that, gone were the pleasantries, gone were the niceties that he had gotten what he wanted from me. And that was that. And I mean, that is absolutely exactly illustrative of your point. It's short-sighted. Like we worked together, for almost a year. Like we were going to have to coexist and he might need help from me in the future, so for him to be so nakedly self-interested, actually, I think was harmful long run practically. But a whole argument of my book is that incivility, cruelty, malice, like maniacally being fixated and pursuing our own self-interest also hurts us at a soulish level as well. That civility is its own reward, and vice and incivility, cruelty to others is its own punishment. I'm happy to say more about that if you want.
That's where I'm going next, because cruelty, you mentioned it a few times, and I think it's one of the brilliant ideas in the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling is that why does anybody follow the bad guy? The bad guy's Lord Voldemort, the bad guy's Hitler, whatever. Why does anybody do that? Only for one reason, because they're given permission to be cruel. They're given authority to be cruel to other people. And there's an anger inside lots of minds, of course, and for lots of reasons. We won't go into that. But that anger makes people want to be cruel because it makes them feel better in the hierarchy if they make even more misery next to them. But you see, it's not in their self-interest. If you step back and see what you're doing, it's not in your self-interest to surround yourself with even more miserable people than before. It's perfectly understand. You take an example of somebody who loses their job. They have a relatively good family life going on, and they lose their job after 15 years. It comes as a shock to them. They go home and they hit their wife or they hit their children or something. They never did that before. Why? Because I think they're trying to keep the hierarchy the way it was, and they're feeling miserable. They push the next one down. So it just seems to me that idea of cruelty, and people talk about evil, and it's not well defined, but cruelty is the center of that. I think, because who wants people around who are getting happy from you being miserable? Because that's basically what it is. They're enjoying you being miserable. That's not a good thing to be around, just like you said about your colleague. And I had a colleague or a boss in a law firm in New York who I really never worked for, but he insisted that I do a certain project for him. And I not only did the project, but I found a fault in it and fixed it. And he was absolutely furious with me for showing that he had made a mistake and tried to get me fired. That was how he responded to it. So it's very common, and it's very funny in its way, but you got to get used to it, that's what's out there if you're going to try to thread your way through this world.
You make an excellent point that we insufficiently appreciate the wisdom behind this cliche that hurt people. Like when someone is thoughtless or malicious, it's so easy, like for me, the baser part of myself, to be like, that's a bad person, like avoid, stay away. My grandmother, on the other hand, had by far the more, and my mother as well for that matter, had by far the more noble and true approach, which is that, this person who is acting callously, thoughtlessly, maliciously, that this is not about me. This is about them, and where they are at in life, and like probably what happened this morning or what happened just before this interaction, when someone slams a door in your face or cuts you off and yells at you and curses at you in traffic or something like that. Like that doesn't come out of nowhere. And my grandmother was excellent at keeping that in mind. Me, I'm like, that's a horrible person. Like, very, very easy to, very human to be like,
Put them
judge
someplace
people
else.
based on what they do. Exactly.
Yeah.
And my grandmother's excellent about, and those are called I call these stories of condemnation. Like we tell stories about the behavior and words and deeds of others based on what we see, and we tell stories of condemnation. Like that's a bad person because of what they've done. My grandmother was excellent at telling stories of exoneration. They're not a bad person. There's a person having a bad day, and like separating the conduct from who the person was, and then going a step further and saying, how can I make their day a little bit brighter? Like they're obviously very wounded. They're carrying a lot of baggage and hurt with them. What can I do to make life a little bit more gentle for them? Because I think our temptation is like, someone comes at us like a vicious animal, we bite right back, right? Which often only adds to the hurt and woundedness that's often just beneath the surface. We insufficiently appreciate the way that anger is like a mask for hurt and woundedness, and so, how might we act differently if we instead tried to tell ourselves stories of exoneration, that exonerate people from not from culpability. Of course, people are responsible for their actions, but at least not making it all about us. Like, oh, this person's out to get us, and telling ourselves a story about the world conspiring to like make us miserable, which is easy to do sometimes. We again, back to our inherent self-love that is like gravity. We have to fight it. Even telling us a story about someone else's malice being about us, when it's really probably more about them having a bad day. That's an expression of our self-love, right? Rearing its ugly head. The Irish philosopher Iris Murdoch, she called it the fat, relentless ego that has to be conquered every moment of every day. And we insufficiently appreciate that, democracy, civilization, a free and flourishing society that we enjoy the benefits of, it depends on our conquering that fat, relentless ego, not letting it drive us and pursuing our own interests maniacally, that considering the needs of others alongside of ourselves in our everyday. And it's a decision that we have to make, every day and every moment of every day as well.
Well, let's show how long this has been going on, because you do a great job of that going backwards. And before, I know you didn't push hard on this at all. You have a Christian background, you said, but obviously a lot of the storytelling that you just have done is all parables that were said by Jesus. There's the parable of the seed. That's what the garden thing is all about. You just told the story about, well, we won't go into all that, but it's amazing how much of his compassionate ideas about how to deal with other people have just sunk totally into Western culture, regardless of whether it's secular or Christian. It's sunk in there as one of the basic storytelling ideas that are behind us.
Yeah.
What's often missed is that he said, be as gentle as doves, but he also said, be as wise as snakes. At the same time, that is, you don't be stupid about it and just let yourself become a victim. Unfortunately, because of his personal life, it looks like he was a victim to a lot of people. But what he said was just the opposite. Don't let other people abuse you. You can get around them. You can deal with them in a way, and he certainly wasn't always polite. So, but let's go back much further and talk about the one from Egypt, Ptah-hotep, I think you said. One of the oldest things there is about civility. I thought that was great.
Well, that's right. And two quick points before we pivot to ancient Egypt. There's this great book I want to commend to your listeners, if you aren't already familiar with it, by a secular classicist called Tom Holland. His book is called Dominion, and it's about how Christianity changed the world. It formed the world as we know it. It gave us this concept of caritas, of charity, that was foreign to the ancient Greco-Roman pagan world. And, this notion of the imago Dei, this notion that is an explicitly Judeo-Christian notion that all human beings have worth. We have the imprint of the divine. God created us in this image. It's this philosophical, theological idea, the imago Dei, that is the intellectual lineage of human rights. And everyone's all for human rights today, right? But we insufficiently appreciate where this idea came from. And we insufficiently appreciate that universal human rights have not been a foregone conclusion for most of human history. Right. That, again, rights were given to citizens, right? To people of a certain skin color, of a certain class, of a certain wealth, right? There have always been these barriers to being treated with respect and dignity, often had class and racial components to it, but stripping all of that down, like just to no, every human being has worth, every human being has dignity. So anyway, if you want to explore that more, that the Christian roots of this idea of dignity and human rights that are attributable, and he's not a Christian evangelist, he's secular, but says like this is just what the literature shows. So it's an excellent point. And then also you mentioned that Christ wasn't polite. I'd like to just hone in on that for a second. I have a section in my book that in my chapter on integrity, unpacking the difference between civility and politeness through the words and actions of Jesus Christ, that he was unafraid to confront hypocrisy, to puncture the pretense and self-righteousness of people, of Pharisees, Sadducees, and others who thought that just by going through the motions, the religious rituals and rites of the day, doing the baths, saying the prayers, that was enough to save them. That was not enough, Christ said. It was the internal disposition of the heart. It was the motivation behind the act that mattered more, a contrite heart and spirit, that in fact, self-righteous acts could cover an evil, sinful heart, and that one could be really cruel and malicious while following the rules. And this is exactly what the Pharisees and Sadducees, tried to do to Christ. They tried to, catch him breaking the rules, right? Like, healing people on the Sabbath, raising people from the dead, like doing acts of philanthropy, of benevolence. Yet they condemned him for that because he's breaking the rules, right? Right. So talk about the disconnect between inner and outer. And Christ was unafraid of calling people out. He was happy, to express emotion, to emote anger, rage. And that was an act of love. That's saying, I respect you enough to call you out for your sin, for your hypocrisy, for your selfishness. And so Christ is a great example to us in that way of this difference between civility and politeness, how actually loving someone, respecting someone means sometimes calling people out, telling hard truths, and not polishing over a difference, not pretending someone is acting in a way, if someone's acting poorly, not pretending that doesn't exist, that actually loving someone means having those uncomfortable conversations. So now back to your question about ancient Egypt. Yes, I go to go ahead. No, go ahead.
Before we go there, for the listeners, that doesn't mean at your Thanksgiving dinner with your relatives that you need to call them out right at the dinner. You wait until after the dinner's over. So. Oh,
promise me.
Timing is still important.
Promise me we'll come back to misplaced meaning and forgiveness, the final chapter of my book, about how we've made idols out of politics and allowed politics to invade our dinner tables when it shouldn't. As we're just out of the Thanksgiving season and heading into the Christmas season, we'll be with family, and I think that's appropriate and would be great to talk about. So, but yeah, back to ancient Egypt. So I start the book with the oldest story in the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh. And I'll let readers enjoy the book itself to unpack the fruits and merits there, but to show that this is a timeless problem. This problem of how do we overcome our self-love and thrive, become fully human in relationship with others. This is not a new phenomenon. We hear a lot of people today, thoughtful people, who say, we're uniquely sad and rude and mean and polarized and divided. And, the reality is every era tends to feel that way. This is what I learned by studying. I'm a student of history. I love history. I love philosophy. But as I studied this literature of civility, conduct manuals, etiquette, ethics manuals from across history and culture, that every era tends to complain about kids these days. TikTok hasn't always been around, but kids have been doing things that have annoyed and vexed their elders since the dawn of history. And in fact, Ptahhotep wrote a book for the youth of his day as well, the oldest etiquette book in the world, the oldest book in the world, which is a manners book. It's on civility. So Ptahhotep was an advisor to the pharaoh in ancient Egypt. He had been in the room where it happens his entire life. He was even offered, he'd reached the pinnacle of business, worldly, political success. And he was even offered the opportunity to become pharaoh of ancient Egypt and become the most powerful, person in the known world. And yet he turned it all down to retire and live a quiet pastoral life. And once he had retired from public life, he reflected on the timeless principles of human flourishing. And he set pen to paper and wrote down these maxims, his teachings, which he intended as a gift to the Pharaoh's son, hoping that Pharaoh's son would adopt these principles and become a wise and just ruler. They ended up being very widely consumed, these maxims, across Egyptian society, but especially by youth and even across history as well. And what's remarkable is that even though these maxims were penned nearly 4,000 years ago, they could appear in a Judith Martin Miss Manners book or column in the Washington Post today. They're timeless. They're remarkably timeless. For example, Tahotep says, "Do not abuse a power differential." He says, if you have authority over someone, be gentle and gracious to them. Don't be cruel to the vulnerable in society. Tahotep says, don't be good to your friends and neighbors just when you need something. be good to them all the time, like countering the very logic of the world, that the baser impulse in ourselves to want to put ourselves before others and, be nice to people when we need stuff. He says, no, don't do that. He just said, be good to them just because they're people, just because they're your friends and neighbors. He says 4 or 5 times.
Clearly your colleague in Washington, D.C. never read that.
Exactly. I'd love to reprint Tahotep and other of these gems from this genre that's like very much forgotten and overlooked today. So he says in 4 or 5 different maxims, don't gossip. Do not slander someone behind their back. Don't malign them. Don't hurt their reputation when they can't defend themselves. Of course, he probably said, do it to their face if you must, like at least give them a fair chance to defend. But we see these and other principles surface, these maxims surface time and time again, and all of them get to the very essence of true civility, as I define it, which is restraining the ego, restraining the worst parts of our self-love, so that we can flourish and live our best life, fulfill our potential as human beings in community and in relationship with others. And so I love that, this book written 4,000 years ago is just as relevant and timely today. And what's great is that though this book, so there was often this intellectual lineage, this core of human wisdom about how to flourish across difference, of how to flourish in general, that was passed on from place to place. As these custodians of this tradition, perpetuated it and reinterpreted old wisdom for our contemporary audience, which is very much the tradition I see myself in today. But yet, people like Tahotep and others, they often came to these ideas independent of one another. They were just thoughtful observers of the human condition and the human experience, and thought, what works? They assessed it. They approached it inductively, like which behavior is conducive to human flourishing, which detracts from it, and they derive these principles from observation, again, independent of a sort of intellectual lineage. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating and so important that that we can appreciate this wisdom today, and this wisdom can still teach us and instruct us because we have a shared humanity that, and we have so much more in common with people, much more in common with people who lived 4 millennia ago than we realize or appreciate.
So we have that ancient Egyptian culture, and just as an aside, one of my favorite translations of hieroglyphics is from about 5,000 years ago, and it's a teacher complaining about the students. And he's saying
tale as old as time. They're not doing your reading, you're cheating,
Yeah. Well, he said, when I was a new teacher, the people were really well behaved and everything, and et cetera, and talked about how good they were. But today they have no respect and everything. And you can see right away that the big problem is actually the variation in age between the teacher and his students. When they start their he was probably 20 and the kids were 12. And, when he's finished, he's 50 or 60 and the kids are still 12. And that's a totally different dynamic. So that's probably the source of the misbehavior of the kids is the age of the teachers. But let's go to a couple of other cultures, because you show that it's in China, the concept of Ren, I think you mentioned. And then we'll go to India. So let's go to China next.
China, this concept of Ren, which is central to Confucian philosophy. First of all, Confucius has a fabulous life and great story if you don't know it. He was someone who, cared about wisdom, cared about the educational project, and cared deeply about the human social project and the ability for us to improve morally in community with others. Like he really believed deeply in moral improvement, and he believed in the possibility of human flourishing through perfecting us and polishing us in society with others. And he, read a lot, studied deeply, thought deeply, and he desperately wanted his ideas to be taken to heart by a ruler in his day. And he wanted to be, the hand of the king, the second in command who was advising the king, and see his ideas take root. And he had all his ideas in theory. He wanted to test them in practice. Mm-hmm. And for several years of his life, he traveled across ancient China, trying to find a ruler, knocking on doors saying, I'm a traveling, roving philosopher for hire. Will you take me in? And no one would have him. And so he went back to his town, discouraged and despondent. And yet he said to himself, I'm not done. I'm not going to give up. And he, started his school and cultivated his disciples, cultivated his community. And he would never appreciate in his day the impact he had on Chinese society, on Eastern philosophy, ethics, culture in general. We've heard it said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Mm-hmm. The same can be said in the East about Confucius, that all of Eastern philosophy is a footnote to Confucius. And his work is beautiful. I encourage everyone to read the Analects and spend some time just like marinating in their beauty and wisdom. It's just so insightful. But he says, he just has a really high view of the human being and the human social project. It is explicitly humanistic. And that is what Ren, which is this idea that is so central to Confucian philosophy is. It's actually two characters. It's the Chinese character for person and then two, like the number two. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of analogous to this idea of Ubuntu. Like a person becomes a person through others, and this kind of this African proverb and concept that we become fully human in community. The idea of Ren, it's rendered as common humanity and as humaneness. And what's beautiful about that is that the Chinese character, again, is about community itself. Mm-hmm. It's the character for a person, but also two people coming together in relationship. Mm-hmm. And so, what I love about Ren is that we see the surface, and it's all about restraint. It's all about restraining ourselves, what we might otherwise want for the sake of community with others. So seeing the same expression, the same idea, this humanistic project surface and manifest with the good life is a life in community, but it's hard and not always easy.
So let's go to maybe the 2nd century BC in India, and the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata includes the Bhagavad Gita, which is the most famous thing, and a lot of people read that in the 60s and 70s here in America too. Plus Thoreau and Emerson all liked it as well. So you mentioned that as the Indian version of talking about the concept of civility. So why don't you just mention that? Well, we're going to skip quickly over a couple of other famous people that you mentioned, and people can get more from your book. But then we'll go to questions from the audience. If anybody has a question that's watching from the live stream, you can put it in the chat. We already have 4 or 5. So if you'd like to add to the conversation, go right ahead.
Well, the Gita and the Mahabharata and Ramayana I am by no means an expert. I should say I've been to India, but I'm by no means an expert. And it would be impossible to do justice to them. As they're right. Longer than the Odyssey and the Iliad, like 10 times over. Like they're just these incredible epics, these treasures of Sanskrit and Indian tradition. But in the Gita, there is this concept that is central to the Hindu philosophy of self-sacrifice, of restraint being the stuff of the good life and necessary to human flourishing and to community. So I don't do justice to these sacred texts, but I did want to draw this through line. And that's what I do in this entire chapter, is draw this through line across sacred and secular and ethical and philosophical traditions about how the good life is the life of restraint, of self-discipline, of voluntarily self-controlling, our self-love for the sake of the good life with others. And I talk about in the book how civility, this restraint for the sake of others, is both an inherent good because people deserve respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. Mm-hmm. But it is also an instrumental good as well. Like, and I have a whole chapter on, you mentioned Thoreau. I have a whole chapter in my book on civil disobedience, reclaiming the whole tradition of civil disobedience in my conception of civility as distinct from mere politeness, so that it can be a tool of efficating justice and social equality in our world today, and it has been and can do that for us today as well.
Let's talk about this idea of restraint, because it's not, it sounds like shackling the personality. But I wanted to point out that if you have a really great actor or actress, it's usually, they're much more powerful when they're restrained, and then their emotion comes out even more strongly, as if the disciplined version has more power than the undisciplined version. And restraint is not a word that you hear in our society very much right now. We have some unrestrained people near the top of society that tend to create a fad in the opposite direction. But that kind of restraint, and restraint is, as you say in your book, is key to civility. So why don't you talk a little bit about restraint is not really a shackle, it's a method of creating more power in your effect.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
And that there is freedom in restraints. There's actually freedom. It's like, if you're a billionaire, but a drug addict and enslaved to a substance, are you really free? And that early discipline, like saying no to a substance early on, that's some might call that a shackle, right? Why not just purely indulge? But then overindulgence becomes its own master, its own slave. I'll tell a story about that. So I talk about St. Augustine in my book and in my chapter 1. Augustine is an important intellectual influence on me. Of course, a very important, like North African philosopher, incredibly influential from Algeria, incredibly influential on all of like human philosophy, but especially Western philosophy, a Neoplatonist. But he, in the City of God, he buys into this duality of human nature that I unpack throughout the book, that the social and the selfish. And he says that an expression of our self-love, he calls the incurvatus in se, the inward curve upon the self, that is this indelible feature of the human spirit, that it's like gravity, that this inward curve upon the self is just always part of who we are, which again is why we have to be mindful of it and resist it day in, day out, and not let it dominate us to the point of inhibiting our flourishing long term. And he says a negative expression of that incurvatus in se is what he calls the libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, that we all have. That is an expression of our, fallen, selfish human nature. That, and you mentioned a quote earlier about how we can delight in cruelty. It's this like perverse delight in seeing the suffering of others. Like that is monstrous. But Augustine says it's wordplay in the original Latin, that he says the more that we indulge the libido dominandi, this lust to dominate, it becomes the dominating lust. The lust to dominate becomes the master becomes the slave to the lust. And so a story, I unpack the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in light of that story, I unpack the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in that context as well. So Dr. Jekyll is this, doctor with a pristine reputation, well beloved by all in society, and yet he is plagued with these lusts, these desires, these baser impulses and instincts that he represses, and he represses and he represses. And finally he feels like he can't repress any longer. And he creates this potion that he drinks at night, and he allows himself to transform into the instantiation of these baser impulses and desires, which is the monstrous and cruel and barbaric Mr. Hyde, who goes out at night in Edinburgh and wreaks havoc on society, kills people, robs people, just does all these things. And of course, he gets away with it with impunity, because by day he's transformed back into the pristine Dr. Jekyll. But something extraordinary happens. The more that Dr. Jekyll takes his potion and transforms into Mr. Hyde, the less he needs the potion to transform. And ultimately, he becomes Mr. Hyde permanently. He actually transforms into Mr. Hyde spontaneously and becomes Mr. Hyde permanently, who eventually kills him. And that is such an embodiment of the example that, or the idea that Augustine unpacks, that the lust to dominate becomes the dominating lust. Like he was conquered. He was vanquished by his lusts in the end. And so that is where there is a role for restraint. There is freedom in self-imposed restraints by saying no, and saying no to what in a small way, restraining our self-interest in a small way, so that we can be a part of community with others and flourish more fully and freely. So you're right. We live today in what Charles Taylor called a cult of authenticity. We're told by society that if you're restraining yourself, you're repressed and you need to let loose and follow your heart and do what you want. And yet people who live according to their lusts, their desires, their impulses, they're often not very happy. And again, back to this idea that when you become dominated by your lusts, you become enslaved to them as well. And true freedom is actually in restraint.
It's an interesting point you make there for a political point, which is that the masters in a slavery situation become the slaves of the slaves in a way. And if more people realize that, it wouldn't be popular. I mean, obviously, it's.
Can we pause there for a second? That is such a great point that I don't think made it into the book. But like this was debated during. In the Civil War era in America. Like after the Civil War, there was this debate. Many Northerners were convinced, like they questioned, could slaveholding Southerners, could they be reintegrated into post-Civil War America? Could they be reintegrated to the Union? And this question exists because people thought and argued that owning another human being, abusing them, being a tyrant, that obviously hurt the enslaved, obviously, but it also deformed the soul. It made tyrants of the soul of the slaveholder and made them utterly unfit for self-governance, which is what a democracy required. That they had exactly what you said, that the lust to dominate had become the dominating lust, that they thought that was a society of not souls that were conducive to democratic regime, but they were oligarchs. There's a great book by, I think his name is a scholar named Forrest Nabors, that retells the story of the Civil War in light of a clash of regimes. Like the South was an oligarchy of the elites ruling the masses. And America, in aspiration, especially after the Civil War, was a democracy, equality of all people under the law and equality of citizens. And could an oligarchy be compatible with a democracy? And many thought no, but it goes back to that exact point that you made. You probably, I don't know if you know this, but the South was very conscientious about creating this, back to this core argument of the book about the difference between civility and politeness, that the South was very conscious about having a culture of gentility and chivalry. The Knights of the Round Table, the tales of King Arthur, those were the lore that they modeled the many parts of Southern society after. They had coats of arms. They reinvigorated the joust. Like they aspired to be these chivalrous, gentle and noble men and women, and yet it was a society propagated by the subjugation of a class of human beings. Like, and so talk about the difference between politeness, like focusing on the polish in a society, the expense of true civility, and a society grounded in true civility. And what I argue in my book, a true civilization, is respect of the equal dignity of all persons, right? Not just people of a certain skin color, of a certain class, of a certain wealth, of a certain talent, of a certain merit, of all human beings. So it's fascinating that this is a timeless question. It's one that's throughout our history and one that is exquisitely relevant to our own moment now. Well,
I'm going to mention that you mentioned Marcus Aurelius several times, and it's interesting that Marcus Aurelius is an emperor, a Roman emperor, and yet very interested in this idea of civility as well, in spite of the fact that obviously he was a military general and everything. But I want to get to the questions. So the other person that I wanted to mention, you have lots of really interesting characters, but you mentioned Erasmus, and you have one line about Erasmus from a man who lived in the 1500s, that he had these ideas which were to reform certain things, and then they got carried away by Luther in another direction and so on. And he was the civil one, and therefore he's overlooked.
Absolutely, this unsung hero.
In
Absolutely.
uncivil time, you get overlooked if you're the civil one. But
exactly. Like that's, tiny footnote, if we can just pause there for a second, that this has kind of been a hamstring to my work gaining traction over the years that I've been working on this project. Like my book, this is a product of a lifetime of thought and a decade of work. Mm-hmm. And, especially I've been working especially assiduously since I left government 5 years ago. And, I'm kind of captive, restrained and almost hamstringed by the subject matter, the very temperate, ironic, ecumenical subject matter I'm writing about, because I'm not going to say the things that, an MSNBC or a Fox News producer might want me to say to get on television, right? That's what's rewarded. And we all know this. There are producers who say, you say this about that person, you say what you say the party line, and we'll make you famous. Like, you'll be on television, or like on social media. Like, I don't get on there and say the incendiary, inflammatory things that go viral, right? Get the hate clicks. And that is what our culture rewards right now. And it has always been thus. It has always been thus. That's what I love about the story of Erasmus. And, if we had more time, we could talk about Luther, the original viral user of social media.
Right.
The Gutenberg printing press, right? And so anyway, this is like a call to arms, I hope, this book. Like, help me make the ideas of this book a success and counter this culture that rewards the incendiary and the inflammatory. And my book is all about these unsung heroes of temperance, of moderation, of wisdom, of grace, that do not get the dap that they're due, but deserve it. I have this whole, my life, I want to spend my life writing these biographies of these pop biographies of people we've never heard of, but have changed our world in ways. Right. But they weren't promotional and marketers, and so I'm happy to promote them even thousands of years after they've died, because they deserve it. And these are stories that can capture our imagination and inspire us now.
You have a great one about somebody who worked for Madison and ended up becoming governor of Illinois, and he wrote to Jefferson about his hypocrisy about slavery, which I'll leave that story for the readers of the book too, because it's a great story about a character who...
Edward Coles, an exceptional story.
Right. So let's take some questions from the audience. And first one, have you noticed general civility waxes or wanes with societal conditions, although a minority of consistently civil people seem to manage regardless? I just thought of a thing I wanted to say, which was, in another book, I'm interviewing somebody in another hour and a half, but there's a quote from Milton Friedman that says that the whole point of having ideas is so that the ideas are never used unless there's a time of crisis. But it's important to discuss it and keep those ideas alive, so that when things really fall apart, people will have something to pick up. And I like to mention that to everybody who works on ideas, because whatever you have to, as you said, you have to be true to your ideas. Otherwise, you lose the whole thread. And even if you get more attention for a little while, but you've lost the consistency of your ideas by doing that. But if you stick to it, then those ideas are sitting there again, reminding everybody this has been used well many times over the years. It's not the majority view, that's for sure. Civility is not the majority view. But there have been many civil societies that have been some of the most productive societies that human beings have created. And then incivility starts to break it all down. But let me go back to that. Have you noticed general civility waxes or wanes with societal conditions, although a minority of consistently civil people seem to manage regardless?
No, it's an excellent question, because a core argument of my book is that this is not a new problem. We hear a lot of people today that are very apocalyptic, claiming that we're on the brink of a civil war and things have never been so bad. And that's actually not the case, thankfully. Things have been, I love to say that history is both a caution and a comfort. It's a caution to us because, in the context of, if you zoom out and look at the story of human history, conflict is the default. Conflict is the norm. Relative peace and prosperity is the exception. And thankfully, in our world today, that's the inverse is true. You know, in our own history, like our country was founded by revolutionary war. We fought a civil war. We've had, you know, profound dehumanization and conflict. Like human history is a story of conflict, and that's a caution to us, because peace and prosperity is not a foregone conclusion. And if we're not careful, and if we don't each take the responsibility we each have to take seriously that responsibility to preserve our society, our democracy, our free way of life, then it could be violent and once again. So it's caution, but also a comfort to us that it's been bad before, it can get again, and yet it's not as bad as it could be yet. So history's caution and comfort. But I mean, to some extent, yes, epiphenomena in a society, societal, technological, demographic changes, like epiphenomena will always stress society. It will test our trust in institutions, our trust in each other. And we're seeing that now with social media, trust in our institutions, trust in our elections, trust in you know, our public leaders. And we always want something to blame. This is crucial, that yes, there are epiphenomena can be stressors to this problem, but the problem of incivility is timeless, and it's human. It's a part of the human condition. And so, you know, just as one public leader and one new technology is not the cause, although we might want to blame them and point fingers.
Yeah.
Similarly, you know, one public policy, one book even is not the solution, right? Like, and the fact is that we should humbly approach this question, because it's insolvable. It's only like made better or worse by, again, each and every one of us in our everyday. My theory of social change is inherently individualistic. It's inherently local. The subtitle of my book is how to heal, you know, the soul of civility. Subtitle: timeless principles to heal society and ourselves. Right. And my theory of social change is that by healing ourselves, that we can heal society too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the method is education, which you talk about. And one of the questions here is, what should schools do to teach students true civility?
So I, in my chapter on education, I actually really emphasize the home. That is where these values, and again, the educational project has been and should once again be explicitly about creating good humans, and cultivating our humanity, and helping us appreciate the profound gift of being human, and thereby appreciating the humanity, the gift of being human in others too. That is the antidote to these dehumanizing, barbaric, and divided times that we live in, where we are very quick to dehumanize and devalue the life of people we disagree with, we differ from. And that's always tempting when the stakes are high, because then it makes it easier to justify doing and saying whatever is necessary to win and to get them and to get ahead. And so, I'll leave it there.
People who feel that way, you know, that you can just ride over a whole other group, don't have any history, or at least are ignoring it, because, I mean, all these groups are way too big for anybody to roll over. They're all different civilizations that have a different way of doing something. Some of the things are exactly the same, as you said. There's a strain of civil thought in every single civilization, or they wouldn't have a civilization. But there's a billion of one group, and a billion of another group, and a billion of another group, and they're not going to go away, and they're not going to change overnight. And it'd probably be better for all of us to become civil before we try to tell them how to do it.
Exactly.
So another question. Do events like the NSDAPS regime aren't isolated unto themselves? Do you see such things arise under desperate circumstances, that desperate societies choose desperado leaders? I don't know what NSDAPS stands for, actually.
Yeah, I don't either. I'll comment quickly on something you said just a moment ago before you got to the question actually about how it's easier to point fingers at other people than look at ourselves. I mean, Christ said that, right? Why are
Yeah,
you looking
yeah.
at the speck of your brother in your brother's eye when you have a log in your own? But also Erasmus has a great line about this. So Erasmus, hold back on him for a second. He was an intellectual superstar of the 16th century. And he, was just this genius, this roaming philosopher, scholar, much like Confucius, actually. And unlike Confucius, who was turned away wherever he went, every kingdom he went to in China, Erasmus was welcomed. He was the most coveted dinner guest in all of Europe. And he would just, every 2 years, he would live in another castle and tutor another prince and just be wined and dined because he was just delightful and a great conversation. He's most famous today. Talk about how he's not claimed really to history. He was a devout Christian. He was critical of the Catholic Church, corruption, indulgences, all these different things. And it's said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, that all of his ideas about criticisms in the Catholic Church were later taken up by Luther, who eventually left the Catholic Church and started the Protestant Reformation. But today, no one claims him, right? The Catholics don't claim him because he was critical of the Catholic Church, even though he never left the Catholic Church. And the Protestants certainly don't claim him because, he never left the Catholic Church, and he and Luther famously had a falling out. So he's lost to history. He's really only known for one thing in history. He's claimed by secular scholars because of his Greek New Testament translation. It's
Right.
just an absolute genius, but he cared deeply about manners to the extent that they supported just the pleasantness of human social life and human flourishing. And so he wrote this book called A Handbook on Manners for Children that you can go on Amazon and buy right now. Or better yet, ask your local bookstore to carry it and then support your local bookstore that way. So anyway, he said this handbook on manners that he published, again, he's a scholar, a true genius, and he published a book on manners that was an international bestseller overnight. It didn't go out of print for 200 years and was translated into every European language. And it's the only book that I'm aware of, the etiquette book that I'm aware of, that categorizes mandates by body part. He has a section on the eyes, what to do and what not to do, the nose, the mouth, just very funny. He's peculiarly against winking. I remember, he says, do not wink at others. But his final maxim, which is so reminiscent of what you said a moment ago, and again, our tendency today is to blame, right? This person, this thing is the problem, right? And Erasmus, he says, the epitome of all manners can be summed up in this maxim, his final maxim in the book. And he says, readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself, which I think is just such a great way to end a book and maybe a way to conclude our conversation. I don't know if we're close to
it's perfect. It's the last time. I'm just going to add a personal note to that because I just got back from a couple of weeks ago from Basel, Switzerland, where I was with two of my brothers, one of them who's an Erasmus scholar, and we went to the publishing house where his stuff was published, and they had a copy of his Bible. The Greek New Testament version. And I wanted to throw in just one little detail, which was that he did part of his work at Thomas More's house in London.
Yes, he did. I've been there. It's called Crosby Hall in London. It's magnificent. Right. Yes.
And who helped him with his Greek translation was Thomas More's oldest daughter.
Oh, wow.
She was a Greek and Latin scholar as well, Margaret. There's a little piece on that in A Man for All Seasons, the play and the movie, that the daughter, the king, is amazed that she can speak Latin and everything. But there's good stories about how she helped correct certain little things. And it's always good to find the women who added to the scholar's reputation.
And often, the great men in history gave opportunities to women, right? They celebrated the abilities and achievements and nurtured that. What an opportunity for Margaret. I didn't realize that was her name, which is also my grandmother's name and also my daughter's name, Sophia Margot. So it's a great name. But that they saw that ability and nurtured it. That's beautiful and a testament to care. Another one is John Stuart Mill, who fell in love with his wife Harriet, and they were true. They loved each other, but they were intellectual companions. And he wrote his treatise on the equality of women and why women should have the vote, largely because he was in love with his wife, who was an absolute genius. That it's a testament, I think, to men across history who were champions of women and other historically oppressed minorities or overlooked populations for just who are automatically discarded as having any merit or ability to contribute to society just by virtue of one aspect of who they are.
And how foolish that's been for all of our civilizations, because we just throw away half the talent and
That's exactly
or
right.
more. And what was that
Exactly.
for? You know,
Right.
It doesn't make any sense at all. And it's the soul of civility to extend it out to everybody.
Yeah. Amen. That's great.
So thank you very much, Alexandra. This was a great interview and a very interesting book, The Soul of Civility. So ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in our 121st year of enlightened discussion. We hope you come back for more. Thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks, Alexandra.